Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West. Supplemental 9, Joan of Arc, Part 4, The Myth. When I began thinking about how I wanted to cover Joan of Arc, I was debating whether to mention her in a few paragraphs, or whether to do a full episode, maybe two about her. Well, now I'm doing my fourth. And while this episode will be a short one, and won't cover her life, as we all know how that ended, I do feel like Joan's afterlife and legend are important enough to merit a bit more discussion. The legend of Joan of Arc began while she was still alive. She first gained some recognition as a holy woman from the Duke of Lorraine before she ever appeared at the Dauphin's court at Chinon. But the legend really began to take off when she arrived at Orléans. When Joan arrived at Orléans, the military leaders viewed her more as a living battle standard than as a fellow military commander. But the people of Orléans viewed her as their salvation. The Journal of the Siege of Orléans records the people's first reaction to the Maid, quote, "From the city, other men-at-arms came to receive her, along with the bourgeois of Orléans, carrying many torches and making such joy as if they had seen God himself descend among them, and not without reason, for they had endured much difficulty, labor, pain, and fear of not being rescued, and of losing their bodies and goods. But they felt already comforted, as though freed of the siege by the divine virtue that they were told resided in that simple maid, whom they regarded with strong affection, men as much as women and little children. And there was a marvelous crowd pressing to touch her or the horse on which she rode." On the other side of the siege lines, the English had also learned of Joan, but their reaction was far different. To them, she was not a holy warrior sent by God, but a heretic inspired by the devil. When Joan sent a message to the English demanding that they surrender, their response was definitively negative. Quote, "They would burn her, for she was nothing but a whore, and that she should return to tending cows." And for most of her career, while she was known as a divinely inspired virgin by the French, to the English and their Burgundian armies, she was, quote, "the whore of the Armagnacs." But even this hostile response belies a level of fear. Even if the English believed that Joan was sent by the devil, she still represented a threat. The victories at Orléans steadily increased her reputation among her allies, and the hatred which her enemies had for her. And when the siege was lifted, news of the Maid began to spread. Throughout France, all began paying attention to Joan of Arc, and we even have records from Venice and Rome discussing her in the weeks after Orléans was relieved. Jean Gerson, one of the leading theologians of the day, and the author of the handbook used by Joan's examiners at Poitiers, began writing 3 new treatises: about a certain maid, about the Maid of Orléans, and about a wonderful victory. The first of these was a fairly neutral and cautious assessment of Joan's claims and deeds. But as he continued writing, and as more news of Joan's exploits reached him in Lyon, he took on a more confident and approving tone. The second and third of these treatises defended Joan's actions, celebrated her victories, and asserted that she was sent by God. Gerson compared the Maid to Deborah and Judith from the Bible, and to St. Catherine, one of the saints which Joan herself claimed to converse with. He even defended her assumption of men's clothes by asserting that her circumstances and mission made it necessary. Gerson was not the only prominent author to write in Joan's defense. Christine de Pizan, currently living in a convent outside of Paris, took up her quill again after a decade of retirement to write the Ditty of Joan of Arc, where she celebrated the Maid and her accomplishments. Like Gerson, de Pizan came to the conclusion that Joan was certainly sent by God, but Christine de Pizan also focused more on Joan as a woman. Some of de Pizan's greatest works, such as the Book of the City of Ladies, celebrated women and their virtues, and so the appearance of Joan on the world stage really inspired the author. Christine wrote in celebration of Joan's boldness and proclaimed that she had, quote, "a heart greater than any man's." Christine de Pizan's work from the 1410s was marred by a pessimism about the state of France. But when Joan of Arc led Charles to Rheims, Christine regained her hope for the future, quote, In the year 1429, the sun began to shine again. Everything has changed because the rejected son of the illegitimate King of France is now crowned with great majesty. You have recovered it by the intelligent maid who, God be thanked, has opened it to you. Can one praise the maid enough for having given peace to this land, so long laid low by war? Esther, Judith, and Deborah were ladies of great renown, through whom God restored his people from great oppression. God has accomplished more miracles through this maid, a girl of 16 years. Is this not a force beyond nature? On whom arms do not weigh heavy, so that her whole upbringing made her this, so strong and hardy. And her enemies flee from her, not one of them can last. She drives them out of France, recovering castles and cities. She is the leader of our worthy and able men. The hope conveyed in Christine's writing was spreading throughout France, and while there is much debate about the extent to which Joan's military command began to swing things around, it cannot be denied that she had a huge effect on the relative morale of the French and English forces. To the French, Joan and her victories were proof that God favored their cause. The Dauphin had faced persistent manpower shortages in the years before 1429. But, after the siege of Orleans was lifted, knights flocked to his banner. Now the French fought with more confidence and determination, while the English began to face their own morale crisis. The Bastard of Orleans remarked that at the siege of Orleans, quote, around 200 Englishmen could put to flight 800 or 1,000 men of the royal army, but from that moment when Joan arrived, 400 or 500 men of the king, fighting against almost all of the English forces, put pressure on the Englishmen at the siege to the point where they did not dare leave their shelters and fortresses. This effect would continue throughout much of the rest of Joan's career, but as she faced setbacks at Paris, at La Charité, and at Compiègne, the English began to recover their wits, and their fear was overshadowed by anger and derision. Joan of Arc should not be credited with the wholesale reversal of Charles's fortunes, but she was the right person at the right place at the right time to begin turning the tables. If nothing else, she was the spark that the Dauphinists needed in 1429. But a spark only lasts for a short time, and Joan's career would not be a long one. Her trial and execution are a defining part of her story, and the records from the trial do a lot to preserve her personality and her life. But in the years after her trial, Charles VII did his best to distance himself from the Maid. He made no public statement about her execution, and, notably, made no attempt to ransom her from John of Luxembourg, or rescue her from Rouen. Admittedly, the Bastard of Orleans and La Hire both tried to organize a rescue, and got some limited support from the court, but neither of these attempts really got off the ground. The trial of Joan of Arc put the king in a delicate position. While the Inquisition had been staffed by men who opposed him politically, it was still an official church inquisition. So to openly oppose its results could bring charges of heresy to Charles himself. And furthermore, Charles did not have much motivation to rush to Joan's defense. In her last months of freedom, she had become somewhat of a liability to him as he attempted to reconcile with the Duke of Burgundy, and he had tried several times to sideline her. He was grateful for her aid, but her defeats had begun to call into question her divine inspiration. When Joan of Arc was found guilty of heresy, that meant that he had been crowned king due to the intervention of a heretic. He was keen to bury that fact, and so did not want to bring any more attention to Joan or his connection to her. If the king were to make a fuss about her trial, he risked another church inquiry, one which might find him guilty of heresy due to his support of her. But most of the rest of France was not bound by the same political constraints as the king was, and Joan remained popular with the people, or at least the people who supported Charles VII. The people of Orleans were especially grateful to Joan of Arc, and from 1435 on, they commemorated the end of the siege with a mystery play that celebrated the Maid as a divine instrument. And when Joan's father died, the town invited her mother to live there and took care of her expenses. Over the years, many family members, comrades, and supporters of Joan of Arc would push for the rehabilitation of her reputation, but it was not until 1450 when Charles VII finally changed his mind and decided that it was time to back this movement. The king authorized an inquiry into Joan's 1431 trial, and especially the influence which the English held over it. And a few years later, the Pope granted permission to begin the nullification, a trial to overturn the judgment of 1431. Now Charles still kept some distance from the nullification trial. He had recently taken Normandy back from the English, and this retrial had the potential to reopen some old wounds. But enough people in France were pushing for it that the king allowed it to happen. Throughout 1455 and 1456, a new Inquisition interviewed many who knew Joan of Arc throughout her entire life, from Domremy to Rouen. After a year and a half, the Inquisition declared, quote, "The truth was passed over in silence, and false assertions were introduced on several essential points, and her responses had been altered, which changed everything. For this reason, we reject and nullify the charges as false. We pronounce that the trial and the sentences, full of slander, contradictions, and manifest error of law and practice, as well as the abjuration, execution, and all that followed, are declared null and void." The nullification not only restored Joan's reputation, but it also further preserved her life. The transcripts from this trial are full of testimony from those who knew her, and, along with transcripts of the 1431 trial, the nullification recorded a ton of detail on Joan of Arc, and selections from both have made it into the past few episodes. Care does have to be taken when reading transcripts from Joan's Inquisition and nullification, as both trials were ideologically driven. But the sheer amount of detail that comes down to us has allowed us to get a vivid picture of Joan in a way that few, if any, other medieval people get. The story of Joan of Arc continued to be told throughout the years, but in the 19th century, general interest began to really take off as she fit quite well into the notion of a romantic hero. This renewed interest culminated in a movement to have Joan of Arc made a saint by the Church. It took a while, but she was finally beatified in 1909, and was declared a saint in 1920. Some wanted to declare her a martyr as well, but this was an uncomfortable move, as she was technically killed by the Church, and so her status as the Maid was leaned on, and she was recognized as a virgin with a capital V. Today, Joan of Arc is one of the most, if not the most, recognizable figures from the Middle Ages. This is, in part, due to all the sources on her that exist, but I think it's more due to just how interesting her story is. A hero rises from obscurity to save her country from the brink of collapse. She accomplishes great things before she begins to suffer setbacks, and, in the end, she is captured, whether by hubris or betrayal, and killed. The screenplay basically writes itself. She's an underdog, she's a true believer, she's a heroic fighter, she's a tragic figure. She's all of these things, and more. I'll admit that Joan of Arc is one of my favorite figures from the Middle Ages, and part of the reason that I'm now doing my 4th episode on her is that I simply wanted to do her story justice, and I hope that I have. The story and legend of Joan of Arc has also been identified with so many different causes throughout the years. She was a symbol of the French monarchy before the Revolution, but was also a favorite of Napoleon. In more modern politics, both the right and left can identify with her. French nationalists and conservatives can identify with her proto-patriotism and devout Catholicism, while leftists and liberals can identify with her persecution by the state and church. She is a symbol both of the French far-right party, the National Front, and of French communists during the Nazi occupation. She's an icon in the feminist movement, and her simultaneous assumption of both male and female gender norms has also led her to be identified with by many trans and non-binary people. Literally hundreds of French schools are named after her, as are hundreds more Catholic schools and churches worldwide. Even the Church of England now recognizes her to be a holy figure. Joan of Arc was larger than life, but I think it's important to remember that she was still a person. She was an extraordinary person, and she achieved the impossible. But if we pay too much attention to the plot of her incredible story, we can lose track of Joan the individual, along with all the nuances and contradictions contained. She was a self-consciously feminine figure, but also took on a role at odds with traditional femininity. She was a wholly devout Christian, but her belief in her personal connection to God put her at odds with the Church. She was a true believer of the French monarchy, but she would be sidelined and abandoned by the king who she believed in. She proved to be a capable commander, but not a creative one. She had one tactic: attack. Buoyed by her confidence in the holy righteousness of her cause, she could not lose. Why worry about strategy, risk management, or tactics? Joan of Arc was smart and witty. She was self-assured and self-righteous. This was sometimes annoying to those around her, but it also made her an inspiring leader. The incredible rise that Joan of Arc had would not have been possible if she had a different personality. But that personality also shaped her fall as Charles VII began to move past the need for her. The story of Joan's rise and fall has been told so many times, both in fiction and nonfiction, and every telling of that story is slightly different. We may never stop telling the story of Joan of Arc, and with each telling, we can bring new perspectives to that story. We can find things to emphasize or downplay about her, depending on our own personal beliefs and worldview. And if you've come out of this stretch of episodes wanting more, I would suggest checking out Joan of Arc, A History by Helen Castor, The Virgin Warrior, The Life and Death of Joan of Arc by Larissa Juliet Taylor, Joan of Arc, Her Story by Regine Pernoud, Joan of Arc, A Military Leader by Kelly DeVries, or any of the other sources I used for these episodes. But now it's time to move on from the Maid. The 100 Years' War goes on without her, and the French resurgence continues, admittedly not always smoothly. Philip the Good is still with the English, but now tensions between the Allies are growing, and Charles VII has begun a more aggressive strategy to try and force him to change sides. In the Low Countries, the Burgundian absorption of Hainaut, Holland, and Zeeland is still fresh, and the death of Philip of St. Pol in 1430 means that now Brabant is up for grabs as well. Richard Vaughan calls the period from 1430 to 1440 Burgundy's critical decade, and Wim Blockmans and Walter Prevenir term a similar period the decisive years. Over the next few episodes, we'll see just why that is. It will be 4 weeks rather than 2 before we begin exploring this critical decade, as I am currently moving, but in a month we will dive into this defining era for Burgundy. Thank you so much to my patrons: Christine, Duchesse de Nemours, Peter, Duc de Brancion, Elliot, Graf von Gravenstein, Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-en-Auxois, Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau, Mark, Comte de Meursault, Diana, Graf von Beersel, Mehmet, Comte Santerre, Chris, Comte de Seymour, David, Graf von Bornum, Rosa, Comte de Germol, Elliot, Comte de Bussy-le-Grand, Quentin, Graf von Blasfeld, Tyler, Comte de Chamaret, Ian, Graf von Arenberg, Eric, Comte de Couche, David, Graf von Barland, Jonathan, Comte de Bazoches, and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at Valois Burgundy on Twitter or Blue Sky, or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. You can also email me at granddukesofthewest@gmail.com. And check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.